Welcome to BCTV Open Studio. My name is Lissa Weinmann. I am a business owner and a resident of Brattleboro, but I'm also a senior fellow at the World Policy Institute in New York, studying nuclear policy issues. And I've had the pleasure and privilege to work with the director on a film that we'll be talking about today called Power Struggle. Power Struggle looks at the 5 years leading up to the closure of the Vermont Yankee Nuclear Power Plant. So I'm going to introduce our panel today, the director and participants in the film. Robbie Leppzer of Turning Tide Productions in Wendell, Massachusetts, just south of the border, has directed Power Struggle along with 17 other films, which all tend to document citizens speaking out and exercising democracy. Many films dealing also with nuclear power issues. So he brings a wealth of expertise to this film, Power Struggle, which will be shown at the Latchis Theater on Thursday, November 3rd. And Governor Shumlin is going to be introducing the film at 7 o'clock p.m. And joining us are two key figures in the film, Maggie Gundersen, who is the executive director of Fairewinds Associates. Fairewinds' mission is to educate the public about nuclear power production, engineering reliability, and safety issues. And also joining us is one of the stars of the film, along with Governor Shumlin and Francis Crowe, the 93-year-old activist, Arnie Gundersen, who has built over 70 nuclear power plants starting in the 1970s. So I would just like to address the panel and get a little sense of everyone's involvement in the film, starting with you, Robbie. How did you come to document this power plant and start making Power Struggle?
Well, I've been working as an independent documentary filmmaker for many years. My work is aired on PBS and CNN and HBO, Cinemax, Sundance Channel. And I live in Western Massachusetts. I live in the small town of Wendell, which is actually 18 miles from Vermont Yankee. So Vermont Yankee has been on my radar for a long time. And as a filmmaker, when I heard that Vermont was in the very unique position of being the only state in the country whose legislature was empowered to make a decision about the future operation of a nuclear power plant, that suggested to me that this story had national significance. And so as a filmmaker, I thought the idea of chronicling this process of a legislature making a decision, but really it's about democracy because it's about citizens in the state who are then having a voice through their elected officials about this really big matter of who gets to decide these major questions of energy. And so as a filmmaker, I thought, to chronicle this process, I had no idea what the outcome was, would be a fascinating documentary.
Right, and I think it's important to point out from the offset that this is not your typical no-nuke film. For me, the film is really about democracy, which makes it so pertinent to the fact that we have the elections coming up, and it's being a part of a democracy is more than just casting a vote once a year. It's having a voice, expressing that voice and how people do it. And this film really gets at that whole issue of what is democracy and how is it practiced. Maggie, can you talk a little bit about your involvement in the film and the issue at large and how it relates to people having a voice?
Well, I founded Fairewinds Associates first, and we worked with the state of Vermont on violations that Entergy was making and on reliability issues. So that speaking truth to power is really an important part of who we are as a couple. And then in 2008, I founded Fairewinds Associates in 2003, and I founded Fairewinds Energy Education, which is a nonprofit 501c3 to educate people around the world about the nuclear power risks and our aging reactors. So that's how we became involved in this story and met with Robbie. And as we brought issues forward on Vermont Yankee, it became more and more clear that Entergy was simply not telling the truth to the state or to the people of Vermont.
And not just Entergy, but also the federal regulators at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has been terrible in disallowing communities to have any role or any say in what waste is being left there, what radiation is being released at all different times, and it's really unfair.
I'd also like to introduce Arnie Gundersen. He's a nuclear engineer, and he's the lead engineer for Fairewinds Energy Associates. He was employed as the head of the oversight panel looking at Vermont Yankee reliability issues leading up to the court cases and the whole history of the plant. But he also was responsible for building some 70 nuclear reactors and was part of that early fervor of nuclear true believers until he pointed out a safety violation at a plant in Connecticut and his life was ruined. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to nuclear power, Arnie, and what happened to you, as well as why you got involved with the state of Vermont?
Well, I started right out of college in 1972, and that's the same year that Vermont Yankee went online. It was one of the very first power plants to produce electricity. So as it was going through its teething problems, I was also a new engineer. Worked my way up to become a senior vice president in the nuclear industry, and then it's not something you aspire to do, but I became a nuclear whistleblower. I brought violations forward, and the NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, covered them up. This winding career path led me to Vermont, where I was appointed to be on the oversight panel of Vermont Yankee when it was considering this license extension for another 20 years. So Vermont Yankee's been in the forefront because it's one of the oldest plants in the country. It's been on the forefront, first to get a license extension, one of the first to be shut down. So we have decommissioning problems now that Vermont Yankee's facing before 100 other nuclear reactors. What to do with the nuclear waste? We're the first one to worry about that too. So Vermont's unique. We have a community that's actively involved, and we have one of the oldest plants in the country. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to be part of that process through Fairewinds, and you know, give a little bit of expert guidance to the legislature throughout that whole process.
And you know the industry so well. And could you just tell us, what is the average age of nuclear reactors in the United States?
Yeah, Vermont Yankee shut down, it was 42 years old. But the average age right now is about 35 years old. So it's 7 years older than the average nuclear reactor. But they're all aging, and they're all coming up upon the end of their design life, which was 40 years. Of course, the nuclear industry wants to extend them for another 20 so they can make more money. I don't think that's a good idea, and Peter Shumlin didn't think it was a good idea either.
Yes, well, we have a clip of Attorney General Sorrell talking about Vermont's fight that we can just, if we could show it now, that would be great.
And just to say, this was from an interview that I conducted with Attorney General Sorrell, who talked in the context of the suit that Entergy brought against the state of Vermont, trying to overthrow the law or overturn the law that gave the legislature a voice in the future operation of Vermont Yankee.
And also, that was an agreement that Entergy had made with the state of Vermont to give the state authority to decide upon the relicensing. So that was also a contractual obligation that Entergy entered into at the time of the purchase. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. When they bought the plant in 2002, they gave the state the authority to say yes or no beyond 40 years. And then when they got there and they didn't get what they wanted, they sued us. And
Right, because the Senate voted 26-4 to retire the reactor. This was right before Peter Shumlin came to office. And Entergy fell back on the fact that only the federal government could decide, which I think is at the heart of this film. The federal government, because of the origins of nuclear power in terms of the nuclear bomb and defense, has always been just the province of the federal authorities.
Well, to be clear, though, and you can clarify this, is that it's my understanding that the federal government, or through the NRC, has sole jurisdiction over safety matters. However, it's been affirmed in an earlier Supreme Court ruling that states do have authority over non-safety matters.
Which is the discussion of reliability versus not being able to even discuss issues of safety, even as safety violations were piling up at the old reactor.
When I was on the panel, the oversight panel, we were very careful not to look at safety issues. And in fact, we stumbled on a couple, and through Bernie Sanders, got the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to look at those. But we understood loud and clear that we were a reliability focus to avoid that quagmire that Entergy threw up, the smokescreen they put up to confuse and allow them to continue to operate.
Well, let's go to the Sorrell clip right now, and we can hear from Attorney General Sorrell that matter.
I don't think it's too much to say that this is an anti-democratic situation. You've got a large, wealthy out-of-state corporation trying to have its way and override the legitimate laws of a sovereign state. And it's a power struggle. Unfortunately, Vermont being its size, it's a David versus Goliath power struggle, but it's one we've got a lot of energy to fight.
Can we talk a little bit, the film looks a little bit at how Fukushima, the continuing nuclear disaster at Fukushima, played into this whole closure of Vermont Yankee. And I know that you've been consulting quite a bit. In fact, Power Struggle itself, a shorter version of the film, has been broadcast in Japan because the Japanese people are so hungry for information, which their government largely suppresses, regarding what continues to happen there. Can you talk a little bit about how Fukushima had a role to play in the closure? I know the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had extended the Vermont Yankee license just a day before the disaster started. Can you address that, Arnie?
The nuclear reactors at Fukushima are identical to the nuclear reactor at Vermont Yankee. And as a matter of fact, the first nuclear reactor at Fukushima just got its license extension to run for beyond its 40th year, 1 month before it blew up and began the legacy for the Fukushima disaster. So what we've got here is built by the same people, and it was built by the same companies with all of the same design assumptions. So what we saw on TV for Fukushima is exactly like what could have happened here in Brattleboro.
But wasn't that due to just an extraordinary circumstance?
No, it's not an extraordinary circumstance. Any plant where the cooling pumps are destroyed at the waterline, that could happen at Vermont Yankee, and Entergy has denied that again and again. But the cooling pumps are down. If there was a flood and they were destroyed, the same thing would have happened at Yankee. It had happened every single plant in the country has to be on water. They're either on lakes or on rivers or on the ocean. And so there can be flooding, there can be high tides, there can be tsunamis.
Or there can be terrorist attacks.
Right. Or there could simply be loss of power.
Which was exactly what was happening at Fukushima Daiichi Unit 4, which is where the Americans were told to evacuate out to 50 miles. I mean, 50 miles is Wendell and then all the way down to Northampton. So the evacuation zone, because of that design with that fuel pool on the top floor, is really should be a 50-mile zone, and in fact, we only had 10.
And they've abandoned some of the emergency planning around the Vermont Yankee reactor because the plant is now closing. Do you think that's a prudent measure?
No, it's not a prudent measure. This is the most dangerous time. Moving the fuel is extremely dangerous.
We're very fortunate to have Governor Shumlin, who came to office basically on a Retire Vermont Yankee platform, speaking and introducing the film, which, by the way, Power Struggle will be aired for the public broadcast at the Latchis Theater, the sneak peek on Thursday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. Tickets are $25, but
$20 in advance.
$20 in advance.
Or $25 at the door. It's a benefit fundraiser to help launch the film on a national tour.
Right,
And a national tour costs a lot of money. You know,
Right.
so this help is really needed. But there are student passes as well.
Yes, $10 for students. And free for high school students.
And free for high school students. And it's important to say also that nobody's going to be turned away for lack of funds. It's an extremely important issue for our area, and the film is very informative. There'll be a panel discussion after the screening that will include Kate O'Connor, who's the head of the Vermont Yankee Decommissioning Advisory Panel, as well as film participants. So,
including Arnie and Maggie Gundersen.
Arnie, Maggie Gundersen,
and myself as filmmaker.
We'll be there for the post-panel discussion, so we encourage people to come. And just to hear a little bit about the flavor that Peter Shumlin brought to this, maybe we can just go to the clip
And I can
about
just
Peter Shumlin.
describe
set
that.
it up.
This is a press conference that Governor Shumlin gave only 2 months after he came to office. And it was just 6 days after the disaster at Fukushima began. And what I thought was pretty remarkable about the governor's statements was that there was no other governor in the country, much less higher elected officials, who were saying the things that he was saying at that time. And so I thought it was a pretty extraordinary statement for a governor to make, because he was placing the Vermont Yankee issue into this broader context of Fukushima, and he understood the importance immediately and spoke to it, I felt, quite eloquently.
Yes, I would agree. Let's share that clip with our audiences right now.
They're more involved in what's happening in Japan than they are now.
Good afternoon. If anything falls from this tragedy in Japan, for Vermont and for America, I hope it's that we see it as an opportunity to re-examine our policy of irrational exuberance around extending the licenses of our aging nuclear power fleet. We have 104 aging nuclear power plants in America. We've always been told that they're earthquake-proof. Explain that to the people of Japan. We've always been told that the spent fuel is safe and stored properly. Explain that to the folks in Japan. I don't think that our strategies are any smarter than Japan. All I have is good old Vermont common sense. You can't run an old rig past its design life. And if you do, you're inviting disaster.
Yeah, that is good old Vermont common sense. You shouldn't run an old rig past its prime. And in fact, Germany, right in the initial days of Fukushima, had announced it was closing all its Mark I reactors. Isn't that right, Arnie?
Well, they immediately shut down the old Mark Is, and then they also, shortly thereafter, decided that they would shut down all their nuclear power plants by 2022. So they're halfway to a complete closure of nuclear. You know, there's 23 other nuclear reactors identical to the Fukushima design. Vermont Yankee's just one of 23 in America. Chicago is ringed by a whole raft of Mark I reactors, as is down the Atlantic coast. The hurricane recently just missed a Mark I reactor. So this, the same people from the same companies built all 23
Well, let's
of
say
them.
it, General Electric. It's a
Yeah.
General Electric reactor.
And it was built by a company in Manhattan called Ebasco. The engineers, I used to drive into Manhattan to work with those engineers.
Didn't
and I
one
used
of
to
the-
fly out to San Diego to work with the General Electric engineers on the Mark I.
Didn't one of the designing engineers on the Mark I's actually quit in protest to the design?
3 engineers quit in '76, and they basically said, they came to the conclusion that I got to 14 years later, but they basically said the system's rigged, this containment's not safe, and we're appalled that you're allowing it to continue to operate.
It's stunning that they should even be operating now.
You know, in '86, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission said there's an 85% probability that that containment, the Mark I design, would blow up in the event of a meltdown. And it happened 3 times in a row at Fukushima. So this didn't just happen. Maggie and I were walking down the street 6 weeks before the accident. And she asked me, where's the next nuclear disaster going to occur? I said, I don't know where, but I know it's going to be at a Mark I design. So the whole industry knew that this was the weak link. So to claim that we're suddenly surprised that 3 reactors blew up is hogwash.
But Arnie, why would we continue to operate these reactors if we know that the design is flawed, if we know what's happened at Fukushima? Why are they still running?
Money. There's a huge, the Entergy, of course, is a big funder of political campaigns. Exelon, another big funder of political campaigns. And they have managed to control who Congress appoints to run the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So it's being run by nuclear cheerleaders as opposed to nuclear watchdogs.
Well, let's go to the clip where you talk about the Mark I reactors right now so the audience can see.
Well, let me add an interesting thing about this clip. This clip starts with Arnie talking, and then it goes to this archival footage that I got from the Japanese television showing the construction of Fukushima, which was happening at the very same time that Vermont Yankee was being constructed. And if you notice in the film, you'll see this hill. It's an aerial shot, and then there's a flat plain. And maybe, Arnie, you can talk about the significance of that, because when I found out that information, it's very interesting.
To save money, they cut the hill down and built the plant very close to the ocean. And of course, and then they ignored thousands of years of tsunami history that showed that the level they were at would easily be inundated. So it's an example of they needed to make the plant cheap. And the fuse was lit for the Fukushima Daiichi disaster back in the late 60s with the design decisions that went in. Those same design decisions went into Vermont Yankee.
Let's go to the clip.
In the United States, there's 23 General Electric Mark I reactors identical to Fukushima Daiichi. Vermont Yankee came online almost identical time to Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1. They have the same design. They're the same reactor, same contractors worked on them, and the same flaws and weaknesses. The containment structure designed to hold in all the radioactivity after an accident is too small. By 1986, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had determined there was an 85% probability that the containment would blow up and fail in the event of a meltdown. So much hydrogen gas would be released that the containment would be blown to smithereens and all of the radioactivity inside it would be released to the public. Fukushima showed us 100%, 3 of them blew up. The regulators have known that this design is incapable of withstanding an accident since it was built. During the middle of the crisis of Fukushima Daiichi, one of the key regulators at the NRC, a guy named Chuck Casto, said, "This is the worst containment in the world." Well, if it's the worst containment in the world, why are we keeping 23 of them running here in America?
Well, what's really interesting is the role of big money in politics today, and we see it in this issue. And one of the reasons that the power struggle is so interesting is because it really focuses on citizens informing themselves and having a voice. And a lot of people think that because the plant is now closed, that our troubles are over. But in fact, my research has indicated that the troubles in some way have just begun, because what we are looking at is an extended period where we're going to have the nuclear waste on the banks of the Connecticut River at the plant. And I know our legislators have been involved with trying to give the community more voice in how that waste is stored. And there's been some talk about a resurgence of nuclear power here in the United States to deal with global warming. And I know that you've been studying that issue. Can you talk a little bit about Fairewinds' research into this question of, is nuclear power the answer to global warming? It certainly doesn't seem so from where I sit.
Fairewinds Energy Education did a whole series of studies for a year with 2 PhDs and 5 interns for initially on a project to look at the CO2 that is produced from nuclear power plants and how that impacts global warming, and if they would have any impact if they're all shut down. And the percentages are very, very clear. New nukes make global warming significantly worse. And Arnie can speak to some of the exact math details, but I'm really proud of the work that Fairewinds Energy Education did. We have just issued a report which has already been translated to Japanese, and we did a film that came out from Arnie speaking at McGill, and then in 2 weeks we'll be having we'll also have an animation and another report coming out, and a podcast with our interns.
And the audience can look at some of these videos at your website at fairewinds.org and Fair, F-A-I-R-E, for energywinds.org, because this is an important point. Arnie, maybe you can just briefly tell us, why is nuclear not a solution for global warming?
You know, when I started, I had this religious fervor that all the nuclear people had at the time in the 70s, but it was never about carbon dioxide. It was never about global warming and greenhouse gases. It was about an energy shortage, and nuclear was supposed to be cheap and abundant. And in fact, it was never cheap. Every single plant went well over budget, and none of them ever were built on time. And so all of the premises that I built it for, to save the world from an energy crisis and to provide cheap power, were proven wrong. So this whole issue of carbon dioxide, this just came up in the last 20 years. And it's a smokescreen. It's a marketing ploy. They can't make money if they're allowed to compete. So now they're hiding behind, well, we're going to be good for the world. What we showed crystal clear in the analysis was that building the new power plants and keeping the old ones keeping the old ones running is taking money that could be spent on renewables. And you probably get 5 times more bang for your buck by putting that into a renewable than you do into nuclear power.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize the heavy federal subsidies that have gone into nuclear power to keep it going, and probably nowhere as impressive as in the taxpayer getting stuck with the burden of the long-term storage of nuclear waste. I just read this report about the new reactor that just opened in Tennessee, and it was a long story in the Washington Post, but never was there a mention of the cost of and the challenge of the long-term storage of the waste that these plants are producing. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just touch on, now that the plant is closed, what are we looking at? They say 60 years they can leave the plant sit there. We already know that there has been radioactive leaks underneath the plant. What are we looking at moving forward, and why do citizens need to remain informed?
The plants, all of them, every single one in the country is leaking radiation. The industry claims that tritium just passes through the body in 50, 60 days and passes through like water. But scientific data has proved that for 15 years, it's been proven, in fact, that tritium crosses the placental barrier, and it really impacts cells and organs in our bodies. And the tritium at Vermont Yankee, for example, moves faster migrates faster towards the Connecticut River and towards the aquifer. Whereas the other radioactive isotopes that have already been uncovered, and Entergy didn't test for a lot, cesium, which is a bone seeker, cesium, which is a muscle seeker, strontium, which is a bone seeker, and cobalt are migrating more slowly, but they follow the same path as tritium. All those radioactive isotopes are there, moving towards the river, moving towards the aquifer. And if the carcass sits there for 60 years, those leaks of non-existent buried and underground pipes, because that's what Entergy claimed to the legislature, that they never had any pipes and they lied under oath. But they did. That came out when the tritium leak was brought forward at the State House. Yes. So those buildings remaining there means the tritium continues to leak. All this radioactivity seeps into our waters, our land, our river.
And what's the danger of these materials?
It runs
people
up the cost.
hear this word, but they don't realize how it impacts on them. Can you talk about them being cancer-causing?
Yeah. The downstream is the Connecticut River. And if we clean it up now, a lot of that radiation won't make it to the Connecticut River. If we wait 60 years, it will. And the costs are going to be higher. And what has concerned all of us in the nuclear industry, supporting the public, is that Vermont Yankee can just walk away. They said they would walk away after 60 years, leaving us with all the real cleanup costs to clean up that whole site. So I've been saying now for years, to clean it up now is actually cheaper than letting that radiation run.
Is our groundwater, am I correct to understand that it's really Entergy who is responsible for checking the groundwater and reporting back, not our state officials?
The state, Entergy has the monitoring wells, Entergy does the initial testing. What our oversight at many, many nuclear plants in our testimony, many plants across the country shows none of them know what they're releasing. None of them have an accurate tracking of what they're doing. We've seen plants where one plant had, at a site, had 0 releases, claimed it had 0 releases. And then 2 more plants were added to that site. So 3 plants, and they're still claiming they have 0 releases. And the NRC looks at that and says, well, they checked the box, they turned their report in, so it must be true.
So the federal regulators depend on the honesty of the corporation regarding the sampling. So we really don't know what's happening with the groundwater necessarily, but one thing seems clear, that a faster decommissioning can help avoid some potential problems
Robbie
in the
caught
future.
this in the film. The Vermont has a concerned citizenry that some other sites don't, but some do. And it's probably the town hall model. We have a participatory democracy here that the film really tries to pick up on. And because of that, we've been a thorn in Entergy's side for a long time. We're smarter than the average bear. And so the people in Vermont were really a significant cause in the shutdown of the plant. Entergy would like to claim it was only about money, but in fact, a smart citizenry helped to close the plant and will help to monitor that plant moving forward.
And I think that's what Power Struggle's about. I love the name because it's a struggle not just about the source for energy or how to look for energy, but what the people's right is. And the tussle between the military-industrial complex and people who don't want their land polluted and they want to raise their children in a safe environment. And Robbie's captured that. And he's captured that it takes all of these people coming together to make their voices heard.
Yeah, I would say Power Struggle is a film about democracy in action. It's about whether people's voices will be heard against big moneyed interests.
Right.
And it's about what people in our local area are doing for a safe and sustainable energy future.
Yeah, which is why the screening on Thursday, November 3rd is going to be so important, I think, because...
At the Latchis Theater.
At the Latchis
At 7
Theater.
o'clock.
At 7 o'clock p.m., because we're looking at a presidential election, and a lot is in play next year on this issue. We've got a number of bills supported by our Vermont delegation that would give the community more say in the decommissioning process, give the community more say in nuclear waste storage. I understand that the industry itself is facing a crisis in terms of where to put the nuclear waste, so they are pushing for changes right now. The question is, will citizens be involved? And I think that's why it's so important to take a look back at the past. That's what Power Struggle does, look at the fight that's been going on and give us all as a community an opportunity to come together and talk about where we're going with this thing.
And I think Power Struggle also is inspirational because it shows people around the country what's coming up for them. Right now, 6 nuclear plants have shut down and 99 remain. And of those 99, 20 are on life support, badgering and lobbying for more taxpayer subsidies to allow them to continue operating. And what people do, their participation in this, we're a model to show them how to raise their voices and say they don't want their tax dollars to go to that. They don't want to keep an old leaking plant, impacting their environment. There's a city in Illinois where the whole city water has been so contaminated that they have to be on bottled water and pumpers in for the whole city from a nuclear plant that's leaked into their water supply and contaminated everything. Do we want that in Vermont? Do other cities want that? No, but that's what's happening if people don't step in.
And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission will let them get away with it unless there's an active population. Robbie's film shows that. I mean, citizens were in the NRC's face, and that's what it takes to get action out of an agency that's really a lapdog.
And I think that, again, this movement here in Vermont has reverberations nationally.
Absolutely.
And one of the people I filmed in the film is Senator Bernie Sanders.
That's right.
And I filmed him several years before he announced his campaign for the Democratic nomination for president. It was a rally in April of 2012, a month after the 40-year license expired, at a rally right here in Brattleboro on the Commons. And what I thought was remarkable about what he said then was putting this struggle right here in Brattleboro, right here in Vermont, in a national and even international context.
That's right. Yes, I remember that. Well, let's show the audience a clip of that, and then we can wrap up this discussion. But it is important to go to Bernie Sanders because as a U.S. Senator, he has the power to rewrite some of these laws in the year ahead. And as we know, many of these laws will be rewritten in the year ahead because the industry needs them to be rewritten, and the industry is pushing for it. And whether or not citizens have a voice is up to each one of us. Let's go to Bernie Sanders.
What many of you are working on is one of the great struggles of our time, to create an energy future which protects not only our generation, but a safe energy future for our kids and our grandchildren. That's what we're talking about. What we are also talking about is the need to transform our energy system away from nuclear power, away from fossil fuel, into energy efficiency and into sustainable energy. In Vermont, if we shut down Vermont Yankee, if we move to energy efficiency, if we are aggressive about wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, and other emerging sustainable technologies, this small state can lead America in a new energy direction and lead the world in that direction.
Bernie Sanders, once again, speaking several years ago, but right on the money. no more federal subsidies for nuclear, no more federal subsidies for the waste. It's time to make the industry pay up and see if they can compete on a level playing field with other renewable energy sources that our community might prefer to have. All right, this concludes this episode of BCTV Open Studio. I'd like to thank Robbie Leppzer, Maggie Gundersen, and Arnie Gundersen for your participation. And I'd like to encourage everyone to come out at the Latchis Theater on Thursday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. for the sneak peek screening of Power Struggle. It will be broadcast on HBO sometime next year, so you'll get a chance to see our community in action and learn more about this important issue and where we go with Vermont Yankee. And you can also visit the website, Power Struggle, the movie.
No, Power Struggle Movie.
PowerStruggleMovie.com, where you can see a trailer and get some more information. Governor Shumlin will be making introductory comments about the film, and you can meet many of the film participants and really learn where we go from here on this critically important issue. Thank you.